toward the One, the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, the only being, united with all the illuminated souls who form the embodiment of the Master, the Spirit of Guidance. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. 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 Hasbunallah, 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 hasbunallah. Hasbunallah, 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 hasbunallah. Hasbunallah, 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 hasbunallah. Hasbunallah, hasbunallah, hasbunallah. Hasbunallah, 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 hasbunallah. Astaghfirullah, 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 astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah, 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 astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah, 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 astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. Almanahu, la ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah, 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 la ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah, 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 la ilaha illallah. Oh, illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. 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 La illallah. La illallah. La illallah. La illallah. 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 La illallah, 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 Allahu, Allahu, Allahu. Mm, 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 mm. Mm. Ya Hakam, Ya Alim, 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 Ya Hakam, Ya Alim. Mm. Well, I thought I would speak a little more on the Sufi view. And I may repeat some of the things that I said in part one, but that's okay. This is completely unrehearsed, just like the rest of my life. So one thing to understand about the Sufi path or the Sufi way or the Sufi deen, if you will, is that as many Sufis you ask a particular question, as many answers you'll get, and probably a couple of extra just for completeness. Because it's said that the Sufi has two points of view, his or her own, their own, and that of the other. And this has many implications and many nuances. And one gets to a place where one no longer sees saints and sinners, but just the one being, the one consciousness in varying degrees of sleep or wakefulness. And from that perspective, this thing that I'm doing just now called teaching is as much imparting information, didactic information, as it is a conversation with those parts of my own being inside of my skin or outside of this meat suit that need to hear whatever the words are. And sometimes the conversation is the other direction. It's the students who are instructing me, maybe not consciously, but I certainly learn more from the people that I'm nominally teaching than they do from me. For that matter, I don't know that I'm even that good of a teacher. So there's that. And the Sufi work is like a three-legged stool in a couple of different ways. And one way of looking at it is that there's that which we call the teaching, which has an overt kind of instruction, imparting information. Here's how you do this practice. Here's the, the subtle energy mechanics of some process. And then there's also something that's more of a direct transmission, heart to heart, mind to mind, soul to soul, that completely bypasses the ego, the personalities, and even the bodies that the one being is engaging in this dialogue. So the oral teachings are really a carrier wave for something which cannot be spoken. Until it takes root in a certain way, it can't even really be thought about meaningfully. It's a kind of tilling the soil and then casting the seed. Some of the seeds will sprout. Some of them won't, at least not right away. Sometimes there's not enough moisture to trigger sprouting, or there's something else. Maybe that particular patch of the ground of the being of the student is too cold and needs to be warmed up before a seed will sprout. But that we call the teaching is a whole being process. And while it's useful and certainly entertaining to read all of the verbiage that's been produced by the Sufis or about the Sufis, that's not really the teaching. The teaching is that which directly quickens the heart and provides a certain kind of mirror to the soul, that the soul can see itself. And then it becomes able by degrees to perceive itself directly without the mirroring. And that's kind of a second birth of all of us. And when the soul is able to perceive its own substance directly without mirroring from something external, it's a great initiation. And it changes everything. So of the teaching, the teacher, and the taught, those are the three legs. And the teacher, there's different kinds of teachers. Some of them can only impart the didactic stuff. And there's some that have the capacity, through having awakened their own deep substance through this non-mirroring, having had it mirrored to themselves so many times by their own teachers and by nature and through practice and simply through grace, that awakening occurs. And in a sense, nobody's a Sufi until that awakening has happened. So it's been said that there is no Sufism without a Sufi. There's no awakened unfolding without the factor of awakening. And the best teachers will even while they're talking about stuff, they could be talking about anything, but they're engaged in this process of a direct transmission to the heart and soul of the student, so that mirroring happens, and then the need for the mirroring goes away. And when that happens, what looks on the surface like a teacher and a student, on the inside is really just 2 points of light regarding each other with enormous love and respect and appreciation. And the teacher becomes a spiritual friend rather than so much an instructor. And spiritual friendship is really the nature of the relationship anyway, even though one might have tremendous admiration for one's teacher or the beings in the lineage. It is essentially, the teacher-student relationship is essentially one of friendship, of equal beings whose role and function are different for a time. And one of the things that a teacher in a lineage path like this one, or like the authentic yogas, or Taoism, or Buddhism, or authentic shamanism, there's always a lineage. And it could go back hundreds or even thousands of years of awakened human beings. And the awakened human being is not so much superhuman as they are fully human. And so this is a path of becoming fully human, becoming a grown-ass adult of the human species, which is very rare. And it's rare, at least partly because all of us carry such enormous, breathtakingly enormous potential. And it's so very seldom realized to any great extent in most people. And one very great 20th century Sufi, Suleiman Dede, of the great Mevlevi Sheikh, he said, if we don't do this work, we remain talking animals. And that's kind of harsh, but it's also rather true, unfortunately. And at the same time, we're not dissing the animal part, we're transmuting it. Human beings are not fallen, but descended angels who are at the same time risen apes. Because we have the body and pretty much the mind of apes. And any anthropologist will tell you we're just a species of ape. Pretty fancy, but still, it's amazing what you notice when you step back in a social situation, and kind of mentally turn the sound off and stop listening to the yammer and just watch. Because we are so much primates. It's hilarious. So there's the teaching, there's the teacher. Who is a living representative of the lineage. And there's an initiation, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in that initiation that's given by someone who is empowered to confer that. It's like something gets grafted on. And there's the taught, the students. The ring of hearts that is the study circle. And this path never turns anyone away. But at the same time, people differ tremendously in their capacity to do this work. Not everyone has the same capacity. Not everyone is able to access their own being at a sufficient depth that this transmutation, that this catalyzing given by the teachings and the teacher can happen. And just as the teacher has a certain responsibility to conduct themselves with integrity, and to continue their own work on purifying their ego, purifying their intention, emptying themselves of everything that does not properly belong to them. The student has a certain responsibility as well. What that looks like differs from group to group, from order to order, and each teacher-student relationship is unique and it changes. So it's kind of a moving target. But I'll say that while I personally don't have a lot of rules about it, I'll just mention that so many of the rituals that one observes in the traditional orders or in most paths with regard to the teacher, there's all kinds of rituals. Like you don't speak until you're recognized. You listen carefully to everything and take it as deeply as you can, because it may be being delivered at many levels at once when you ask a question. And you may not know what those levels are until you can access them in yourself, and you'll find out that something was planted there, perhaps years before. And one of the riffs, okay, I'll tell a story. In 2018, I took a small group to India. And even though this was nominally a Sufi pilgrimage, there was this very, very powerful and capacious Swami that we went to Dehradun and spent 3 days with. And he is a guide, was a guide. He's passed on now just this last year or so, maybe 2 years. He was a guide and initiator in the yoga tradition to my mentor, Shahabuddin. He initiated Shahabuddin as a Swami. So Shahabuddin is a Sufi Murshid, and he's a Swami in this particular lineage. And so it was arranged for us to spend some time with this guy. And being the leader of the group, it was my privilege or my function to be the first one to enter the room where we were received. And as it's done, I made a full prostration in front of him, reaching, face to the floor, nose to the floor, reaching out to touch his feet. And from a Western perspective, in our hyper individualized ethos, this can seem to be me giving up all my autonomy and all my power and all of everything that's important and laudable in Western society, you know, in a sense, becoming his slave. But that's not really what was going on there. Aside from the ritual and the custom, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, I was also putting myself as someone who wanted what this guy had, putting myself in a certain relationship with him. So I was submitting my own ego. I was also signaling to him and also subtle energetically establishing a certain relationship with him or with what he was carrying. And in that tradition, the full prostration, and then he would lean down and touch the back of my head to signal that I could get up. But that was also a blessing. They have another kind of blessing among the yogis where you bow or prostrate and they slap your back really hard, which I'd also had him do at a certain point. I mean, I didn't have him do it. He just did it. And then I stood up and he put a garland of marigolds or something around my neck. And then the next person came, and I'd coached everybody on the drill. And he accepted all of us. And we stood there with him, and there was this delicious unity of hearts and intentions. And so, in a sense, that prostration on my part was tilling the ground of a patch of my being for him to plant whatever he wanted. And since I had no idea what that was going to be, nor could I know, there's a certain surrender in that, which is a preparation for surrender to the essential unity that we're all living in, whether we're directly aware of it or not. And yeah, it's a surrender. It was a surrender of my personal will, because my personal will was not going to help me in that particular context. And in fact, it was going to totally be in the way. So I was glad to at least go through the ritual of giving it up and hopefully at some level of substance actually giving it up, at least for the nonce. And this thing of surrender is fraught, especially in our time, where there are so many teachers who um, may not be worthy of that surrender, or may be worthy of it, but also have a thing or two about them that is less welcomable. That also happens. So it's a really difficult confrontation with one's personal ego, or can be. And one really needs a powerful, strong ego, a well-constructed ego on the spiritual path, especially a path of embodiment as this one is. It's less important on a path of transcendence, where you might be living a monastic lifestyle and not need to engage the world very much. But another three-legged stool metaphor is that one leg is our spiritual realization, the level of awareness that we've attained or been opened to, whether you regard that as an attainment or simply a divine gratuitous gift, depends on your perspective. There's certainly a lot of due diligence that's necessary to reach that point where we can surrender, most of us. Or surrender in the right way. So there's one spiritual realization. And on some paths, that's pretty much all it's about. And on the Sufi path, it's one of three legs. The other one being the development of the training of the ego, and by extension, the development of the personality, so that the personality becomes a vehicle for one's realization. So in some paths, you park it at the door with your shoes. And on this path, there's this huge teaching, which Inai Khan calls the art of personality. And there's even a collection of his discourses that are actually given that title. And it's not Sufi charm school. It's a vehicle for authentic contactfulness with all sentient beings. That gets back to the thing that I mentioned at the outset, where one ceases perceiving saints and sinners and simply is aware of the one being, the one consciousness, the one identity. In varying degrees of sleep or wakefulness. And with everyone one meets, one sees oneself in this other myself. And so there's all of this work in developing a beautiful personality to be the vehicle for one's realization. And the third leg is one's work in the world as a further concretization of both realization and the art of personality. And that's going to be different for everyone, and it's going to change as one grows. One could get marching orders to leave town and move somewhere else, or one could get marching orders to go into politics or work for the environment. One of my early Sufi influences was this old murshid named Shamshir. And the word Shamshir is the original word that in English we call scimitar, as in cutting through the shit. And he was a marine engineer. And he'd been a lot of things in his life. He'd also been a spy. And who knows what else. He would never talk very much about that part of his life, except that he got caught doing some kind of undercover work behind the Iron Curtain, sent to Siberia twice and escaping both times. And he'd been doing Sufi work for 60 years at the time that I met him. And he was always impeccably dressed, except that the clothing that he was wearing, the shirts and the jackets and so forth, had probably come in and out of style 3 times since he bought them. And he said with a little bit of good-natured pride when I met him, or at the time that I met him, he was America's oldest civil servant. So he was working at the Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington, designing torpedoes. And he would come to these gatherings of these, Sufi initiates, spiritualized hippies, most of them. You know the scene, this ocean of white cotton. And he seemed to be thoroughly comfortable with these crowds of people that were a third his age sometimes. And one of us confronted him. Even though we knew that he was one of the few surviving direct students of Pir Murshid Inayat Khan, and probably knew a couple of things, some of us were less respectful or polite than others. And someone confronted him. You say you're a spiritual man, but you're building war machines for the man. And his answer was, better me than someone else. And that's all he would say. But that was what he was called to do. And in his spare time, he was working on alternative energy projects. And so when he finally retired from the US government, he went to work in Berkeley, California, and he had an office with the university there working on alternative energy things. So there you go. It's not necessarily any rules about this Sufi stuff. So this phrase that we use, the embodiment of the master, or I understand the newer version of the invocation given by Pirzia is the embodiment of the spirit of guidance, which I'm okay with. I just don't use it. And what does that really mean? And it's a lifetime of discovery and personal development to live into what it means to be an embodiment, a concretization of the master who is the one being and the embodiment of the spirit of guidance. So I wanted to return to the little riff that I did in part one about the divine names and the practices that we do with them, and how that relates to or is different from the zikr. So I mentioned that in a sense, and because language is inherently dualistic, it really can just point to things. At least English can just point to things. The important thing to understand about sacerdotal or sacred languages, Sanskrit, classical Arabic, ancient Hebrew, and a couple of others. The vibration of the sound, or the way these sacred words tune our own being to a certain subtle geometry that underlies the nature of the whole universe and all of consciousness. And so in evoking or invoking the divine names, we are bringing ourselves into a particular alignment with those names such that the self-subsisting beingness of that name mirrors itself into that equivalent in our own being. And there's a kind of mirroring between the microcosm, which is our human incarnation, and the macrocosm of the living reality of the beingness of that divine name. And the living energy of it begins to take up more and more space in our innerscape and begins to purify and nurture the nascent aspect of that name in us. So, as I think I said in my discourse last week, in a sense, the divine names are seeds of a complete and completely mature human personality. So the equivalence or the tiny ends of a continuum between the most personal and the most impersonal exists in ourselves. So we're not creating anything. We're simply watering a seed. And then those seeds will sprout. And very often, humaning being what it is, there may be a counterfeit of a particular divine name that exists in our egos. So, for example, in working with strength, there's an authentic strength, which is a direct connection with, felt connection with the divine strength. Or there can be a counterfeit of it, which is a false strength, an egoic strength. And that's what one sees in bullies. Or instead of love, we see sentimentality. Or instead of compassion, we'll see pity. Or instead of mastery, we'll see manipulation of both ourselves and others. And so, as Anaya Khan says, when something is pure, it's just itself. There's nothing added to it. And so this process of purification that we talk about on the spiritual path is removing everything that doesn't properly belong to us. And as it's been said, when the secret of God enters the heart, all the petty secrets have to move out. And even though one's attention may be on the particulars of something arising with another person or with a situation. And, we're navigating that in the apparent reality outside of our skin. There's always some little bit of awareness that the boundless is transpiring through us, and we are fundamentally not separate from what appears to be arising outside of our skin. It's all of a piece. And we're completely responsive to each breath, each new moment, and our being is informed by both the totality of each new moment, but also the different qualities. Some people call them essential qualities, and an essential state being absorption into one of the qualities. And there's no separation. So I want to say a little bit about purpose. So, as I think I said last week, I talked a little bit about the purpose of this human incarnation. And some people remember being conned into coming here. I think that's probably legit. I think that's probably a real experience. But there's also those of us who volunteered for this. And we perceived in a moment outside of space and time in what the Sufis call al-azal, which is hard to translate, but basically it means pre-eternity. We saw a need and we went, I'm going there. Put me on the first available bus. And I think I mentioned last week that there are two arcs, shall we say, two trajectories of consciousness. One of them is, and I use the term advisedly because it can mean something that it shouldn't be meaning. There's the arc of ascent. And that's kind of classical yoga. It's a lot of Zen. It's Theravada Buddhism, where we sort of park the body, and consciousness, in a sense, ascends through the different planes. And as I said, there's a good deal of distortion in that because that's not really how it works, but it sort of seems that way. It's a model. It's not truth. And especially New Age people get terribly stuck in that model. And at that point, it just stops becoming helpful. But for the sake of discussion, we can talk about ascent and descent. And on the ascent, there's this sloughing of different layers of density. And as a layer is sloughed, we let go of it because the state of consciousness that opens up to us, we're not going anywhere. There's no where that is separate from the one consciousness, but there's different apertures. And the stuff that is sloughed, we let go of because from each successively finer, more refined, more spacious realm of consciousness, we let go of stuff because it looks false. Because the level that we're finding ourselves in is more powerful. It's more fundamental to the structure of how things are put together. The laws are fewer but more profound until we reach that place where the only law is unity. And some paths, that's where you stop. And you're done. But on a path of embodiment, so Sufism, Trika Kawala Shaivism, Kashmir Shaivism, Vajrayana Buddhism, Shingon Buddhism. It's about embodiment, and it's about how the divine being concretizes in, through, and as, especially, a conscious human being. The conscious human being being the one that can encompass both the ascent and the descent in their awareness. And the felt knowledge that that cycle is happening continually, really at every instant. And one of the things that shows up as one traces from the absolute into vibration, an increasing rapidity of vibration as things get denser and denser until there's concrete reality, like precipitated into existence. What shows up is purpose. And the Sufis are fond of quoting the Hadith Qudsi. God is speaking, I was a hidden treasure and I longed to be known, or I had nostalgia to be known, or I had desire. But the kind of desire, it's not offhanded, it's like a longing. So I created the worlds. And so for a long time on the path, there are these two streams, one pulling us back towards unity and the release from ourselves of everything that's false, and also the fulfillment of the purpose of this human incarnation. And for the longest time, these seem to be at cross purposes with each other. But there does come a time when they come together as one thing, as one movement of consciousness. And the Sufis say that whatever else might be the purpose that our theoretical soul had in taking this human incarnation, however it is that we live that out in concrete reality, the purpose is still illumination. So there are paths of mastery, there are paths of devotion, there are paths of surrender. And the Sufis encompass all of those to varying degrees according to the nature of the soul and the mind that is incarnated. But the Sufi path is preeminently a path of illumination. And what that means can only be discovered. But one will have these experiences where one's whole being, body, mind, soul, consciousness is pure light, pure radiance. And that's one of the reasons that the Sufis in this lineage, and especially those of us who were trained by Pir Vilayat, emphasize practices with light. So I'm going to go a little bit over time because we got a bit of a late start. And I want to do a special zikr that I don't think there's a name for it. Maybe I'll make up a name for it. And there's 4 words: Qadam, Qahr, Qadr, and Qayyum. Qadam, Qadm, Qahr, Qahr, Qadr, Qadr, and Qayyum, Qayyum. Qadam is pre-eternity. Qahr is usually given as a practice of divine sovereignty. It's related to, but not the same as the word qahar, which one can find in the Quran, the destroyer. But it's not about destroying anything. Qahar is at once sovereignty. It's a spiritual sovereignty that makes one invulnerable. But it's also the latent potential that we incarnate with. And it's the making alive, making presential that potential. Qadr is that portion of the divine will which belongs to humans. So it's authentic will rather than trying or forcing or efforting. It's when things are done through oneself and one is just a piece of pipe, one's just a vehicle. And Qayyum is in a sense, it's back to eternity. But unlike Qadam, which is untouched by anything, it's like right up there against snuggled right up there with the absolute. Qayyum is what is gained through that whole transit. Into incarnation and back to unity. So the practice is done this way. Attention above the crown center. Ya Qadam. Ya Qadr. Ya Qadr. Ya Qayyum. Ya Qadam. Ya Qahr. 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 Ya Qadr. Ya Qayyum, Ya Qadim, Ya Qahir, Ya Qadir, Ya Qayyum. So it looks like we're having some interesting electrical problems. Perhaps there's some high wind outside and it's affecting the electricity, or who knows? Because you can kind of blank out for just an instant in Qadim. So I don't think you can hurt yourself doing this practice, but do it very slowly. Don't rush through it. Really take your time. Oh God. Let yourself feel that condition where there is no movement at all. It's complete cessation. Yeah. Oh, the immensity of the divine potential coming into manifestation through and as order. And then the return back towards unity. Ya Qayyum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And perhaps there will be more next week.